So here's a project that's functional. It's kind of fun to do, and you can either use it for yourself if you like to play chess, or you can give it away as a gift. In addition to this, you can make the board. That's a whole nother process. I'm just going to show you how to actually make the chess pieces themselves. It involves using a sled. If you have a sled already, that's great. Otherwise, I built this one fairly quickly. What I did was made a 3/4 inch plywood base with a front and back fence that were glued and screwed together. I put runners on the bottom that fit the grooves in my table saw.
The two inside surfaces of the miter gauge slots were pretty parallel to each other and to the blade. So what I did was made the runners narrower than the slots and then butted them up tight against the inside edges of the miter gauge slots.
And then I ran a cut up the middle, and then I installed a second fence that could be shimmed until it was square to the cut. And there's a lot of videos and information on the internet on how to build a sled, so I'm not really going to go into it much more than that. The other thing that mine has in the back is that it has some safety feature that keeps you from accidentally contacting the blade. I put stops on the fence front and back so that when I move the fence in, I can move the sled all the way forward and the blade doesn't come out the back side. I can move the sled all the way back and the blade is totally outside the sled. And that allows me to load and rotate and remove all of the pieces without any danger of contacting the blade. So the first piece to make that's the simplest is the pawn, and up the line from that comes the rook and then the king, which are all not that much more complicated. But the pawn itself has got a cut around the base of it. I don't know if you can see that. It's got a cut around the base of it and two cuts around the top. That's all the more complicated it is. In order to do that, I built a stop, an adjustable stop that clamps to the sled to allow you to reproduce those cuts 16 times, for each of the 16 pawns. The stop is just simplicity in itself. Two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, hot glued together with a rib in there that holds the whole thing square and keeps the two pieces that are glued together from a hinge-like operation where they probably would fail. And I set the stop up a certain distance from the blade. I set the blade height to about 1/8 of an inch, although you could vary that. And in reality, I made that same cut at the base of the pawn around the base of all of the pieces. That simplifies things in that once I make that initial setup, then I cut all of my pieces at the same time and I get exactly the same base on all of the pieces. So the operation is that the stop is clamped to the back fence, the piece is held against the stop, and then it's run over the blade. Brought back, rotated, and done again repeatedly for all four sides of all the pieces. So all of the cuts that are made around the piece are all done this same way with that stop. But to make the cuts in the top of the rooks and the king and the queen, these cuts right there, I basically stood the piece up on end, ran it over the blade, and then kept rotating it and made the cut from all four sides. So essentially the same setup is done to make all of the pawns and all four of the rooks, and a very similar setup is done to make the king and the queen. I made the cut around the base of the king and queen the same, and then I made cuts in the top of the king very similar to what are in the top of the rook. It was done standing up like this. I added some extra cuts along the edges that I'll show you in a second. And then the queen was done in a similar fashion, but instead of spacing the cuts along the top, I centered the cuts and then changed the blade depth to get a stair-stepped effect inside the crown of the queen. The cuts along the length of the piece were done very simply just by laying the piece down. And I set the stop up so that it just covered the edge of the blade. That gave me a clean cut out at the edge of the piece rather than leaving a little feather there. And then I raised the blade height up to be twice the blade width or thickness. I made cuts on all four sides, then I flipped it end for end and made cuts again on all four sides, and it gave me this nice stair-stepped effect on the edges of the king and the queen. And you could do that on the edges of any piece. For example, you could have done that on the rook also, but I chose not to, just to keep it looking different and a little bit simple, to distinguish it more quickly from the king and the queen. So I really only have two pieces that remain to be cut, and that's the bishop and the knight. And the bishop, I tried to make the top of the bishop look like a bishop's mitre hat, bishop's mitre, so that I needed to cut that top piece at an angle. And what I needed to do was to hold the piece at an angle to the blade while I ran it over the blade. I also didn't want to hold it so that it made the cut along the parallel to the sides, but rather parallel to the diagonals of the sides. So the trick was, like a compound miter, to hold it up at an angle and then out at a 45. And the way that I did that was to make a fixture that was relatively simple. I just took a board and then I used my compound miter saw. To make a compound cut along the board, and then all I had to do was to flip the board like that, glue it together, and I created that V, that valley in there, which is what you see here. I made a cut across the face of the piece and put a little shim in there to hold or register the bishop so that it wouldn't slide down during the cut. So that was clamped to the fence, run over. The piece rotated 180 degrees, run over again. And that created the bishop's mitre at the top. And then what I did here was the same thing that I did for the king and the queen. I set up my stop like this. I ran the piece over and then flipped it and ran it again. I could have done that before I cut the miters on it. So that created the bishop with a relatively simple fixture that only took a few minutes to make, just using a compound cut on the miter saw, flipping it, gluing it, and then making the cut to hold a little piece that would register the bishop in there.
You note that I cut the toe of the fixture off, that way I could locate it exactly against the blade, and then I put the top edge of the bishop right where it met the table, and then that helps me to locate that reference curve, that register curve.
So that only left one piece to make, and that was the knight. And it's a stylized knight, just like all the knights are for any chess set. But it looks like the cuts are complicated and difficult to make, but in reality they're very easy. They're all 45-degree angles, and all I really had to do was to position the piece relative to the blade such that I could make the various cuts. So I don't know whether you can see this very clearly or not, but I put a piece in each of the positions. The first cut is made over here. The next cut is made back here by the ear. Then it's flipped around to make this cut for the ear, and then it's rotated to make this cut over here. So once you make the first piece, you move it over here to make this cut, you flip it to make that cut, and then you rotate it around to make that cut. So when I load the piece into various positions, as it goes over the blade, it's going to want to lift the piece up, so I have to make sure that I hold it down. And if I'm not comfortable holding it down with my fingers, although I'm way far away from the blade, I can take another piece like this to hold it down. So it's really not all that bad, and I'm never in danger of contacting the blade.